I wanted to talk about 3 points. A bit of a historical perspective on tax cut generated deficits being used as a justification for austerity. The second point I want to make is debt and deficits are the wrong diagnosis and austerity is the wrong medicine. And finally, I want to put forward some of the revenue side solutions that might be alternatives. So, quick overview. We could go back to the liberal austerity measures. Basically, there was a debt crisis and they solved it. The debt crisis was mainly due to high interest rates, not government overspending in the liberal period, but they mainly solved it by cutting back on transfers to the provinces, which sets the stage for the current reality that the big debt problem is not at the federal level, it's at the provincial level. But that goes back to the liberal era. But the interesting thing is when Harper, the Conservative government, came into power, Harper had a very strong ideological commitment to small government, and he hated the Canadian welfare state. So his personal mission was to unravel or cut back on the Canadian welfare state. His problem? There was a $13 billion surplus. And there'd been a whole string of surpluses before he came to power. How could he make the case for the need to cut back on our social programs when it was clear that not only were they not a problem, like we could afford our social programs, there was room for new social programs like a national housing strategy or a daycare plan. The other problem Harper had is that social programs are actually quite popular. And in fact, almost every Canadian will say that our Medicare system is kind of almost a defining thing about what it means to be Canadian. And Tommy Douglas, who instituted it initially, he's kind of like the all-time Canadian hero. So Harper was up against a huge challenge. What was his strategy? The guy is evil, but he's not stupid. His strategy was tax cuts. Tax cuts are a way easier to sell than cutting back on our healthcare plan or cutting back on employment insurance or other social programs. So he set about trying to create the context that would enable him to proceed with his cutting back the Canadian welfare state plan. And the way he did that, immediately he introduced a 1% reduction in the GST. That took $12 billion out of the revenue. The next year, another 1%, more billions out. Then he decided to lower the Canadian corporate tax rate. We led the race to the bottom. The Brits have caught up to us, I think, now, but we were one of the first in the G7. Huge cuts. That was about $7.5 billion in terms of corporate tax cuts. And then, if that weren't enough, they came up with this brilliant idea of tax-free savings accounts. So if you had money, you could actually get tax-free interest. And of course, even though some poor people would benefit from it, most of the benefit went to the rich. That wasn't enough. They came up with all these boutique tax cuts. So child fitness tax credit. The only catch, it was a tax credit so that you only got the money if you were paying taxes. So low-income families that weren't paying any taxes got nothing, whereas the rich who could send their kids to summer camps or this or that got the full benefit. So very quickly, the government was able to move from surplus to deficit. At the same time, we ran into the world economic crisis, and that helped. That cut revenue. And they could conveniently blame the fact they went into deficit on the economic crisis, but in fact, over 60%, 63% of the deficit was due to tax cuts, not to the economic crisis or fall in revenue. And even if we hadn't had an economic crisis, they would have been into deficit big time, even without that. That did set the stage, and then it helped that he got a majority in his election in 2012. That enabled him, it took off the brakes in terms of parliamentary approval, to proceed with a major austerity program in Canada. So it didn't really hit until after those conditions were set in place. One of the ironies is that one of the biggest cuts in government spending was in the Canada Revenue Agency. They laid off more staff there than any other government department. But it turned out to be a false economy because the uncollected taxes, the lack of capacity to investigate any of the more complicated cases of corporate or wealthy individuals abusing tax havens, just exploded. And so the whole revenue side became a disaster. So austerity is a bitter pill to swallow, especially for those who lose their jobs, who depend on social programs. But it's even more galling when you understand that it's the wrong medicine for our ailing economy. And to cure our economic ills, we need a good diagnosis and the right medicine. The problem with the Canadian economy is not high deficits and debt loads, but weak consumer demand, low productivity resulting from a widening gap in income and wealth distribution, and from too many people who aren't able to contribute to the economy to their full potential because of poverty and unemployment and lack of public services like a quality, affordable childcare program. So increasing government spending on social and economic infrastructure and addressing our climate change challenge is the medicine we need to fix our ailing economy. And although the Liberal government won the election, in large part because the public bought into their promise to run deficits in order to invest more in social and economic infrastructure, they have so far not done very much, as David showed, in terms of changing the overall level of government spending as a share of the economy. Now, to their credit, they have done some important things like a new and improved Canada Child Benefit Program, which is a big step forward. A number of us have worked very hard to lobby for that, and I think we were successful, and it will make a difference in terms of child poverty in Canada. But overall, it's still pretty inadequate to really change to really provide much of a stimulus to the economy or really address in a fundamental way challenges like Aboriginal poverty, unemployment, overall poverty. Even though there's some improvement on the child poverty side, working income age poverty is still a big problem. So while it's a good thing the Liberals weren't afraid of deficits, that's what killed the NDP's chances of forming a government. They were hung up on the deficit thing. I warned them. I was consulted both by the Liberals and the NDP about their election platform. So the NDP, I told them, you're going to be outflanked by the Liberals unless you are more ambitious in what you're proposing. And I was true. But anyway, even though the Liberals are prepared to run a bit of a deficit, the level of government investment needed to really address the major challenges that we face require more money than would be available just by running deficits. And the problem is, with Trump coming to power, there is a real danger that U.S. will increase interest rates. And one of the reasons deficit financing has been an option is because interest rates are so low, you're crazy not to use the money when it's practically coming for free. But if interest rates rise, that could change that equation. So it's critical that for the Liberal government, the new government, to have the capacity to really address some of the challenges we face, they've got to look to revenue side solutions. And fortunately for them, the alternative federal budget has just worked on and produced a whole range of revenue side solutions that it's not quite finished. We've got the almost final draft, and you're going to be the first ones to hear about this. But David hopefully is going to help finalize it in the next few weeks. But here are some of the options. Close regressive and ineffective tax loopholes and simplify the tax system. David's going to speak more to that a little later, but there are all kinds of huge amounts of government expenditure actually is in tax loopholes in the form of tax, not indirect, and it hardly gets reviewed. And most of it goes to the rich. It's totally unfair, but it's also almost totally ineffective. With a few exceptions, a lot of the programs do not achieve their intended purpose. So there are all kinds of things like the stock option deduction, the capital gains inclusion rate. If you earn your money, you have to pay taxes 100% of it. If you actually get your money from investments, you only pay taxes on 50% of it. How can you justify that when the investment, a lot of it is crap? It's like speculation. It's not doing any productive good. Maybe back in the day it might have been justified because that would be, investment creates jobs. That doesn't work anymore in the current climate. So why should that be subsidized, in effect, by government giving away money to the already rich? Tax-free savings accounts, we really need to set, even though the amount at about $100 million lost is not huge, it will grow exponentially. So if you don't set a lifetime cap on that, it will get out of hand and just eat into revenue. And again, that goes disproportionately to the rich. We need to reduce the RRSP contribution limits and cancel pension income splitting. And that would generate about $2.2 billion, which could be used to actually increase the guaranteed income supplement for seniors and help reduce seniors' poverty. We need to review and replace many of the boutique tax credits. That would save about $200 million. We need to cancel the corporate meals and entertainment expense deduction. When you go to a hockey game, those corporate boxes, you're paying for that. Taxpayers are paying for that. Neil Brooks, the tax law professor at Osgood Law School, said there's more fraud going on at one Blue Jays baseball game than all the welfare fraud in Ontario in a year. A US study has shown there's more fraud committed in the entertainment deduction than anything else, because technically you have to be doing business when you're at these games. How much business goes on? Very little. Like, it's just a total fraud. Anyway, the other thing is, I think we could also limit deductions for executive compensation. Corporations should not be allowed to write off more than a certain amount. In fact, the US already does this. So we're not, we could just copy the US on this one. That may end under Trump, but anyway. And finally, we need to end fossil fuel subsidies. It's estimated $1.6 billion is still going to subsidize the fossil fuel industry. Canada did start reducing some of it as a result of G20 commitments, but that effort is stalled, and so that needs to be done. Second main point, end corporate tax dodging and make corporations pay their fair share. So we tried the reducing corporate taxes. It didn't work. It didn't generate jobs. It just created dead money sitting there doing nothing. That needs to be reversed. We need to increase corporate tax rates. A government would find much better ways to spend the money than the corporations have been able to. And we need to crack down on international tax avoidance and evasion through tax havens. Now, again, to give the Liberal government credit, they have adopted many of our recommendations on going after wealthy individuals who are cheating on their taxes using tax havens. We did, a year ago, we did a study, what's wrong at the Canada Revenue Agency and how to fix it. And just when they came into power, we said, here's what you can do. And it was all very detailed. And to their credit, they've taken it seriously, and they're doing a lot of that. But what they have not done is dealt with the problem of corporate tax evasion, which is probably 2/3 of the problem. I don't know, what do your estimate on this? But various sources would estimate the wealthy individuals are about 1/3, big corporations are about 2/3 of the problem, but a lot of that is in the gray area. The corporations will say, oh, what we do is all legal. Crap. They cross the line all over the place. They know you cross the line a little bit, you can get away with it. If you go too far, like Cameco, the uranium miner did, they might nail you. They're in court now being charged with tax evasion for massive profit shifting, just like the South African example. We're suffering the same thing as well. But when you set up, you sell your intellectual property or your trademark to an offshore subsidiary, and then they charge a fee for using your Starbucks or other logos on the store, and that funnels money. All that kind of stuff goes on, and it's really hard for governments to stop that, because what's the fair market value for a particular drug patent or a trademark? But there are some ways that Canada, a lot of this has to be done at the international level, but there are some steps Canada could take. We could introduce an economic substance law that says unless there is actual economic substance to an offshore subsidiary, it shouldn't count as a separate entity for tax purposes. We could put a cap on interest payments to offshore subsidiaries. The UK has just done that. We could follow suit on that. And we could apply a 1% withholding tax on Canadian assets. Another area is e-commerce. Google and Facebook rather, two companies are capturing 64% of all internet advertising. That's the part of the advertising revenue that's going up. Newspaper advertising, broadcasting advertising, they're all going down. These two companies get a total exemption from paying any value-added taxes, the GST or HST, and no corporate income taxes because they've been given an exemption because they don't have a physical presence in Canada, even though they dominate key sectors of our economy. They're getting away, and that's true for Uber, for Amazon, for Airbnb. All of these e-commerce companies who are becoming major players in the Canadian economy are unfair competition to domestic corporations. And they should be taxed to level the playing field. Other countries are doing that. It's time Canada modernized its tax policy. Finally, we need to introduce a stronger and more progressive carbon tax. The federal government is taking some initiatives on this, but they're kind of letting each province do their own thing. And there can be some flexibility, but they should insist on two things. One, a similar price across the board, and they should insist that part of the revenue be returned to medium and lower income people as a green tax credit. to at least ensure that it doesn't harm distribution. So federal government is not doing enough to set the parameters on a carbon tax. And it should not be revenue neutral. Some of the revenue needs to be used to invest in public transit, for example. What's the point of creating a negative incentive, a disincentive for using your car if you don't also present the positive alternative of public transit that is convenient and as a way to switch? Otherwise, you're just going to shoulder people with higher costs without any actual positive impact in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. We also talk about implementing a financial transaction tax and wealth and inheritance taxes. And all total comes to about $40 or $50 billion, which would be a pretty good chunk of change that would enable the government to actually do a lot more in terms of addressing poverty, climate change, Aboriginal rights, health, education, all these things that are not only critical to our quality of life, but I would argue are critical to our international competitiveness and our economic success, because businesses depend on high quality of education. One of the reasons our auto sector has been managing to survive is because we have healthcare, Medicare system that makes the total wage bill for companies much lower in Canada than in the US. So these things are advantages and should be pursued as part of an overall economic strategy that balances economic and social goals and environmental goals, and they are all compatible. And the alternative federal budget shows all the good ways you could spend the money that we raise. Okay, thank you.